The flight was just taking off when tension ignited in the first-class cabin. A sharp-tongued businessman, brimming with arrogance, zeroed in on an unassuming older man sitting quietly by the window. The older man's modest tan jacket and worn loafers made him an easy target for ridicule. With every word, the businessman's mockery grew louder, catching the attention of nearby passengers. But what the businessman didn't know would change everything. This wasn't just another quiet traveler. The older man's calm, unbothered demeanor hid a powerful truth that would leave the entire cabin stunned. When the moment of revelation finally came, the businessman's smug grin vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. What happened next was a lesson in humility that no one on that plane would forget. A story of arrogance, respect, and redemption was about to unfold. The terminal was buzzing with the early morning energy of travelers heading to Los Angeles. The first-class gate exuded an air of exclusivity as passengers clutched their carry-ons and coffee cups. Among them was a man in his mid-40s, his tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes making him stand out. He exuded confidence, walking as if the world owed him admiration. His briefcase swung in perfect rhythm with his calculated steps, every move radiating superiority. He barely glanced at the others in line, his gaze carrying a hint of disdain for anyone who didn't meet his self-imposed standards. To him, this wasn't just a flight. It was another opportunity to assert his dominance, even among strangers. Settling into his first-class seat, he pulled out a sleek tablet and began scrolling through emails, his expression distant and important. He paid no mind to the steady stream of passengers filing in until an older man shuffled into the cabin. The man was unassuming, dressed in a tan jacket and plaid shirt, carrying a small, nondescript bag. His loafers were worn, his posture relaxed, and his movements calm and deliberate. The businessman noticed him immediately, his brow furrowing. To him, this man didn't fit the image of first class. As the older man settled into a seat nearby, adjusting his jacket and placing his bag under the seat in front of him, the businessman couldn't help but smirk. He leaned slightly forward, just enough for the older man to hear. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he muttered, loud enough to turn a few heads. The older man didn't respond. He simply glanced at the businessman, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze to the window. The businessman's smirk widened. The silence wasn't enough to satisfy him. "What's the occasion?" he pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" Still, the older man didn't react. He adjusted his seatbelt and continued looking out the window, his calmness only fueling the businessman's irritation. To the businessman, silence was a challenge, a refusal to acknowledge his superiority. He leaned back in his seat, glancing around to see if anyone else was entertained by his comments. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. As the plane began to taxi, the businessman couldn't shake the irritation gnawing at him. The older man's quiet presence, his refusal to engage, felt like an affront. This was supposed to be his domain, a place where he was in control. Yet this man, with his modest appearance and calm demeanor, didn't seem affected by his jabs. The businessman's thoughts churned as the flight attendant passed by, checking seat belts and smiling politely. He barely noticed her, his focus locked on the older man, who remained composed, almost as if he were above the petty comments. The businessman crossed one leg over the other, his polished shoe catching the light, and decided he wouldn't let this go. To him, the flight had just begun, and so had the game. Little did he know, the lesson he was about to learn would change him forever. The plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into its usual rhythm. The soft murmur of conversations, the rustling of newspapers, and the occasional ding of a call button filled the air. But for the businessman, the calm atmosphere only heightened his irritation. He couldn't understand how the older man could sit so quietly, unaffected by the remarks he had made. The businessman uncrossed his legs and leaned slightly into the aisle, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the older man. The man's gaze remained fixed on the clouds outside the window, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The businessman couldn't resist breaking the silence again. "I'm curious," he began, his voice louder than before, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. "What brings someone like you to first class?" Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers? A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A woman seated a few rows ahead subtly turned her head, her disapproval evident in her furrowed brow. A young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the businessman and the older man. The tension in the cabin grew heavier with each word. The older man didn't react immediately. He took a slow, measured breath before turning his head slightly toward the businessman. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The older man's gaze was calm, steady, and unbothered, as though he were silently sizing up the businessman's intentions. Without saying a word, he turned back to the window. The businessman's smirk returned, fueled by what he interpreted as a victory. "Not much for conversation, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." He chuckled as if expecting laughter or approval from the other passengers. Instead, the silence around him deepened. The older man adjusted the cuff of his tan jacket and continued to look out the window, his composure unshaken. Nearby passengers began shifting in their seats. The tension was palpable. A woman in her 50s glared at the businessman, but her sharp glance didn't deter him. He turned his attention to a fellow passenger across the aisle, a man in a press suit. "You know," the businessman said, gesturing toward the older man, "people like to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man in the suit gave a weak chuckle, clearly uncomfortable. He nodded politely but avoided further engagement. The businessman either didn't notice or didn't care. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms triumphantly, as if he'd delivered some profound insight. The older man's silence, however, was deafening. His calm demeanor, his refusal to engage, made every mocking word from the businessman feel hollow. Passengers around them grew more uneasy, their discomfort evident in their shifting postures and quiet whispers. The businessman, still oblivious to the growing disapproval, continued his commentary, now speaking to no one in particular. "They always talk about how things were better back then, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant appeared, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her smile was professional but strained, the tension in the cabin clearly not lost on her. She paused at the older man's row, leaning down slightly with a respectful tone. "Mr. the Hollywood legend, would you like coffee or tea?" The businessman froze mid-sentence. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the words registered. Mr. the Hollywood legend. His mind raced as he processed the name, disbelief washing over him like a wave. Could it really be? The older man turned toward the flight attendant with a polite smile. "Coffee, black please," he said, his voice calm and steady. The businessman's face turned pale. The Hollywood legend. The name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Passengers around him began whispering, the quiet hum of curiosity spreading through the cabin. "Is that really him?" a woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's the Hollywood legend," whispered another passenger. The businessman's jaw tightened as the truth settled in. The man he had been mocking wasn't just another quiet traveler. He was the Hollywood legend, a Hollywood legend, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The businessman slumped in his seat, his arrogance replaced by an overwhelming wave of humiliation. The older man, the Hollywood legend, calmly sipped his coffee, seemingly unaware or simply unbothered by the revelation spreading through the cabin. For the businessman, however, the moment was excruciating. He had spent the entire flight belittling someone whose quiet dignity now shone brighter than any smug remark he could conjure. The businessman's humiliation was far from over. The lesson he was about to learn would play out in front of the entire cabin. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, his chest tightening as the weight of realization sank in. The Hollywood legend. The Hollywood legend. His mind raced, piecing together the unmistakable voice, the calm demeanor, and the name the flight attendant had uttered. He glanced at the older man, now sipping his coffee with quiet composure. How could he have been so blind? A ripple of whispers filled the cabin as more passengers caught on. "That's the Hollywood legend," a woman murmured excitedly to her husband. "I can't believe it." Her husband leaned closer, craning his neck for a better view. Across the aisle, a young couple exchanged astonished glances, their whispers turning into muted exclamations. The businessman's face burned. Every word he had spoken earlier now felt like a sharp sting, echoing back at him with humiliating clarity. The mocking comments, the condescending tone, the dismissive attitude, they all painted a picture he could no longer deny. He wasn't the confident, self-assured man he believed himself to be. He was a fool, and everyone in the cabin could see it. He stole another glance at the Hollywood legend. The older man's expression remained calm, unbothered by the growing attention. He seemed entirely at ease, as though the situation barely warranted his notice. That calmness only amplified the businessman's discomfort. He had spent the entire flight trying to provoke a reaction, yet now he realized the older man had already won the unspoken battle without uttering a single harsh word. The businessman shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrest tightly. He wanted to say something, anything, to diffuse the tension and redeem himself, but the words wouldn't come. His confidence, once so unshakable, had vanished. He felt exposed, as if every passenger in the cabin were staring at him, judging him for his arrogance. The whispers grew louder. "It really is him," someone said a few rows back. "I can't believe he's on this flight." Another voice chimed in. "And that guy's been mocking him this whole time." Laughter rippled through the cabin, faint but cutting. The businessman's stomach churned. His carefully curated image, the tailored suit, the polished shoes, the air of authority, felt meaningless now. He wasn't the center of attention anymore, and for the first time he realized how small that made him feel. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak. Leaning slightly forward in his seat, he addressed the Hollywood legend hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. the Hollywood legend," he said, his voice low and tentative, a far cry from the loud, mocking tone he had used earlier. The Hollywood legend turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto the businessman. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't friendly either. It was a gaze filled with quiet authority, the kind that demanded respect without saying a word. The businessman swallowed hard, feeling as though he were being sized up, his character laid bare under that steady gaze. "Yes?" the Hollywood legend said simply, his voice calm and measured. The businessman opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. How could he apologize for what he had done? How could he undo the damage of his words? Nothing he could say felt sufficient. I didn't realize," he stammered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The Hollywood legend raised an eyebrow, waiting. His silence was deafening, forcing the businessman to confront the weight of his own actions. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman added awkwardly. I didn't recognize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed the Hollywood legend's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am," he asked, his tone sharp yet calm, "would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" The businessman blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The Hollywood legend's question hit harder than he expected, cutting through every excuse he had been preparing. He lowered his gaze, feeling the full weight of his arrogance. Nearby passengers grew quieter, their attention fixed on the exchange. Even the flight attendants slowed their pace, stealing glances as they moved through the aisles. The businessman felt the tension pressing down on him, the unspoken judgment of everyone around him. He finally mustered the courage to speak again. "I guess not," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. His words felt hollow, as though they carried no weight compared to the lesson the Hollywood legend had just delivered with a single sentence. The Hollywood legend gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip, signaling that the conversation was over. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson the Hollywood legend had just delivered hung heavy in the air, an unspoken challenge that he couldn't ignore. The businessman slumped back in his seat, his mind racing. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people based on their appearance, status, or perceived importance. How many opportunities had he missed to connect, to understand, because of his own arrogance. The older man's calm words echoed in his head. Would that make the way you spoke to me okay? He glanced at the Hollywood legend again, who had returned his gaze to the window. The older man seemed entirely at peace, unbothered by the attention he was receiving. There was no smugness in his expression, no sense of victory. It was as though he had already moved on, leaving the businessman to grapple with his own reflection. The businessman took another deep breath, his chest tightening as he replayed the interaction in his mind. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to assert his dominance, that he hadn't stopped to consider the impact of his words. Now sitting in the shadow of the Hollywood legend's quiet authority, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Passengers around him continued to whisper, their admiration for the Hollywood legend evident in their hushed tones. The businessman closed his eyes, wishing he could rewind the clock and erase the mistakes he had made. But deep down, he knew that wasn't possible. The only thing he could do now was learn from the lesson he had been given. The businessman sat stiffly in his seat, replaying the Hollywood legend's words in his mind. The quiet authority of the Hollywood legend's response was more powerful than any raised voice or angry retort could have been. It forced him to confront the truth about himself, and it wasn't a flattering realization. For the first time in years, the businessman felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly humbled. After a few minutes of silence, he leaned forward again, his voice hesitant and soft. "Mr. the Hollywood legend," he began, his usual confidence replaced by a tone of nervous respect. "I owe you an apology." The Hollywood legend turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the businessman once more. His expression was calm but unyielding, the kind of look that could make a person question their very foundation. "You don't need to explain," the Hollywood legend said evenly, cutting off the businessman before he could continue. "What's done is done." The businessman opened his mouth to argue, but the Hollywood legend raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. There was no hostility in his gesture, only a quiet firmness that commanded attention. "But," the Hollywood legend continued, "there's a lesson here if you're willing to hear it." The businessman nodded quickly, eager to redeem himself. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm listening." The Hollywood legend leaned back in his seat, his fingers loosely wrapping around his coffee cup. The cabin had grown noticeably quieter, the hum of conversation fading as passengers turned their attention toward the older man. Even the flight attendants, busy with their tasks, slowed their movements, their eyes darting toward the scene. "People think respect is something you earn by being someone important," the Hollywood legend began, his voice steady and deliberate. "Someone with a title, a reputation, or a legacy. But real respect doesn't work that way." The businessman's breath caught in his chest. Each word felt like a mirror being held up to him, forcing him to see the flaws in his own character. The Hollywood legend continued, his gaze unwavering. "Respect isn't about who the other person is," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "It's about who you are. It's about how you choose to treat people, even when you think no one's watching." The businessman lowered his head, his cheeks flushing with shame. He had spent his life measuring success by titles, wealth, and external validation. Yet here was a man who had achieved immeasurable success, calmly explaining that those things didn't matter when it came to basic human decency. The Hollywood legend took a slow sip of his coffee before setting it back down on the tray table. "I've been around long enough to know that people like to make quick judgments," he said. "They look at someone and think they've got them all figured out based on what they see. But those assumptions, they say more about the person making them than the person they're about." The businessman swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to respond, to explain himself, but he knew there was nothing he could say to justify his actions. The Hollywood legend's words had cut straight through his defenses, leaving him with nothing but the truth. The older man tilted his head slightly, his expression softening just enough to show he wasn't speaking out of anger. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," he said. "I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it. The next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you, remember this moment." The businessman nodded slowly, his mind racing. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people, colleagues, strangers, even friends, because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of success. He thought of the intern he had ridiculed for suggesting an idea, only for that idea to become a cornerstone of the company's success months later. He thought of the janitor at his office he had never bothered to greet, until the day that same janitor helped him pick up scattered papers after he tripped in the hallway. Each memory was like a weight pressing down on his chest, forcing him to confront the reality of his arrogance. He had spent years building a life based on external markers of success, only to realize that those things meant nothing when it came to his character. The Hollywood legend's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Respect isn't conditional," he said firmly. "It's not something you give out based on what someone looks like, what they're wearing, or whether or not you recognize their name. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat people, no matter who they are." The businessman felt his face flush again. The Hollywood legend's words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. They weren't just a rebuke. They were a challenge, an invitation to change. The cabin was completely still now, the other passengers hanging on every word. Even those who had initially been disinterested couldn't help but be drawn in by the quiet power of the Hollywood legend's presence. The businessman glanced around, noticing the admiration in their eyes. It wasn't just about who the Hollywood legend was. It was about how he carried himself, with a dignity and strength that didn't need validation. The Hollywood legend took another sip of his coffee, his gaze shifting back to the window. For him, the conversation seemed to be over. But for the businessman, it was far from finished. The older man's words echoed in his mind, each sentence hitting harder the more he replayed them. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The businessman leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "I needed to hear that." The Hollywood legend didn't respond immediately. He set his coffee cup down again and turned his head, offering the businessman a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of approval or forgiveness. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement that the businessman had taken the first step toward understanding the lesson. As the Hollywood legend turned back to the window, the businessman leaned back in his seat, his thoughts racing. He felt as though a mirror had been held up to him, forcing him to see himself for who he truly was. And while that reflection wasn't easy to look at, it was necessary. The lesson wasn't just about respect, it was about character. It was about how he wanted to be remembered, not just by the people who mattered to him, but by anyone whose life he touched. And for the first time in years, the businessman felt a glimmer of hope that he could change. As the plane began its descent, the familiar jolt of the landing gear deploying brought the businessman back to the present. The cabin lights brightened slightly and the flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking seat belts and tray tables. For most passengers, it was just another routine landing, but for the businessman, it was anything but ordinary. He glanced out the window, the sprawling Los Angeles skyline coming into view. Normally, the sight would fill him with excitement, a rush of energy for the deals and meetings awaiting him in the city. But today, it felt different. The skyline wasn't just a destination, it was a reminder of who he had been when he boarded this flight. A man who measured success by power, status, and appearances. And now, after a few hours sitting near the Hollywood legend, he saw just how shallow and flawed that perspective had been. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the businessman took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside him. The cabin filled with the sounds of landing, the soft chime of seatbelt signs turning off, the rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, and the low hum of conversations. But for him, everything felt muffled, like the world around him was moving at a different pace. He glanced at the Hollywood legend one more time. The older man rose from his seat with deliberate calm, retrieving his modest carry-on bag and slinging it over one shoulder. His movements were unhurried, his demeanor unchanged. He seemed entirely at peace, as though the events of the flight hadn't affected him in the slightest. Yet for the businessman, they had changed everything. As the Hollywood legend turned toward the aisle, he paused for a moment, his gaze falling on the businessman. For a brief second, the businessman felt like a child caught doing something wrong. For a brief second, The businessman felt like a child caught doing something wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another apology, but before he could say anything, the Hollywood legend gave him a small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug or dismissive. It was forgiving. "Take care of yourself," the Hollywood legend said quietly, his voice steady and calm. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that lingered in the air. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a reminder, an invitation to be better. And with that, the Hollywood legend turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the businessman sitting there, stunned. As the older man moved through the aisle, the other passengers couldn't help but watch. There was admiration in their eyes, not just because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. The Hollywood legend didn't demand respect. He earned it through quiet strength, dignity, and authenticity. And as the businessman observed the way people looked at the Hollywood legend, he realized that kind of respect was worth far more than any title or achievement. The businessman remained seated as the flow of passengers moved toward the exit. His mind was a storm of thoughts and emotions, but one feeling stood out above the rest: resolve. He couldn't undo what had happened on this flight, but he could choose what came next. The Hollywood legend's words weren't just a rebuke. They were an opportunity to change the way he viewed himself and others. As he finally stood and shuffled into the aisle, he noticed the way other passengers gave him brief glances. Some were disapproving, others sympathetic, but none lingered. The humiliation he had felt earlier still burned, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled his determination to grow from this experience. Walking through the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal, the businessman felt the stark contrast between the introspective quiet of the flight and the bright, chaotic energy of the airport. The hum of activity, the flashing screens, and the steady stream of travelers felt almost overwhelming. But as he made his way toward the baggage claim, the Hollywood legend's words stayed with him, grounding him amidst the noise. At the baggage carousel, he paused for a moment, pulling out his phone. His instinct was to dive back into work, to check emails and bury himself in his usual routine. But instead, he opened the note he had written earlier and stared at the three simple words: "Be like the Hollywood legend." He added a new line beneath it: "Respect isn't conditional." He stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. They weren't just reminders. They were a promise to himself. As he left the terminal and stepped into the Los Angeles sun, the businessman felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. And with that humility came a glimmer of hope. The hope that he could start again, this time with a heart more open and a mind more willing to listen. The flight had been a turning point, a moment of clarity that had stripped away his arrogance and left him with a simple but profound truth. True respect isn't about status, power, or wealth. It's about how you treat others, even when no one is watching. The businessman took a deep breath, the warmth of the sun on his face a stark contrast to the cool, reflective air of the flight. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to being the person he was before. Sometimes life's most important lessons come from unexpected places. For the businessman on that flight, what started as an ordinary trip turned into a transformative experience. The Hollywood legend's calm words were more than a response. They were a mirror, reflecting the truth about respect and humility. It's not about who someone is, their status, or their possessions. It's about how you choose to treat them, even when no one's watching. This story isn't just about one man's mistake. It's about the opportunity we all have to be better. How often do we judge others based on appearances or dismiss people without a second thought? How often do we let arrogance cloud our ability to connect and empathize? The Hollywood legend's lesson is a reminder to pause, reflect, and choose kindness over condescension, respect over judgment. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect. Think about the times you may have judged someone unfairly or missed an opportunity to show respect. Share this story with someone who might need a gentle reminder about the power of humility and the importance of treating others with dignity. And remember, growth isn't about perfection. It's about learning, changing, and striving to do better every day. Let this story be a turning point, just like it was for the businessman. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? How would you handle a moment of realization like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us to grow. Together, we can create a world where respect isn't just an option, it's a way of life.